Hi everyone, so today we'll be looking at Storm on the Island by Seamus Heaney. Some of the themes we'll be discussing are power of nature versus mankind, appearance versus reality, isolation and fear. And as always, we'll be using the 4-step approach to analyse this poem. For more of a breakdown on this, make sure to check out my other video on how to analyse any poem. Okay, so let's get started. Firstly, looking at the significance of the title. Storm on the Island is one of the anthology poems which arguably doesn't have a whole lot of metaphorical meaning behind its title. However, you can still talk about the significance of the first word of the title, storm. This immediately captures the idea of the power of nature, and of course it tells the reader what's to come in the context of the poem. You could also say there's a sense of isolation created through the use of the word island, which we'd usually associate with a physical isolation and even perhaps some aspects of vulnerability. Now moving on to the significance of the structure. We can see the poem is one long stanza made up of 19 lines. When initially reading the poem, especially the first 2 lines, we might think this represents a united force of the people on the island. However, as the storm attacks and destroys the island, it quickly becomes apparent to the reader that actually the structure may symbolize the unbroken force of the nature of the storm. We can also look at another angle of interpretation, that the one single stanza might embody the isolation of the island, and particularly its vulnerability during the storm. Just a quick reminder, if you're finding this video helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Another key structural aspect of the poem is the use of enjambment, meaning the lines all flow into one another without any real pause. This reflects the sense of urgency and the narrator's building anxiety. This is emphasized also through what might come across as the stream of consciousness. We as the reader actively see how his mindset transforms from thinking that the island can withstand the pressure of the weather, but soon he realizes that the power of nature is too strong. Another key structural technique worth making a note of is the use of the collective pronoun we. We see this repeated in the first line, and it provides an immediate sense of togetherness as well as working really well as a conversational technique to intrigue the reader. As the storm takes on the island and begins its destruction, we still see the narrator use the word we towards the end, phrases like we are bombarded or we just sit tight. However, this is in a much more defeated tone. This of course now gives us, the readers, the impression that everyone on the island and their human power could not overpower or save themselves from the destructive force of the power of nature. Therefore, this really pushes the idea of the power of mankind versus nature. Now let's move on to some of the key language techniques. The narrator describes the earth to be the wizened earth, which has never troubled the people of the island. This is ironic because, of course, we soon come to find out that the severity of the storm is something that they actually can't handle, and it brings them, in fact, a lot of trouble. Now, we've briefly touched on this before, but the poem is quite conversational and uses colloquial address, like when the narrator says, "you might think." Similar to the use of we, this makes the reader feel as though they are part of the experience, making it much more personal and reflective to read. The poem also uses alliteration, which we can see in lines like "spits like a tame cat turned savage," and "blows full blast," and "stacks are loose." This echoes the sound of the wind, particularly with the S sounds. This makes the imagery more aggressive and intense, almost giving the reader their own experience in how powerful nature is. "Spits like a tame cat" is also a simile, which emphasizes the unpredictability of nature. Think of it this way. We may usually think of cats as domesticated. However, like the storm, they can be unpredictable or turn violent. This essentially animalizes the power of nature. The poem also uses sensory imagery, like in the line, "exploding comfortably down on the cliffs." This also functions to further the idea of nature's immense power by engaging with the reader's senses. We also see some use of personification, for example in the line, "the wind dives and strafes invisibly." This idea of the wind diving almost resembles it to a warplane, depicting the storm to be a hostile attacker, making the people of the island its victim. If you get this poem for the exam and you have to compare it to another poem about war, for example Exposure, make sure to look for imagery like this. It doesn't necessarily have to be about the war, but things that imply the power of nature is an enemy. We also see personification of the weather in other areas of the poem. For example, leaves and branches can raise a tragic chorus. This further reinforces the idea of nature being awarded this power to emphasize its ability to take control over the stability of the island and its people. Lastly, the line, "a huge nothing that we fear," is an oxymoron, which highlights the invisibility of the power of the storm, and essentially the narrator pointing out that we are scared of something that we cannot see. This adds a sense of the storm being supernatural, and therefore more powerful than humanity. Now looking at shift in tone. We've touched on this when looking at the structural and language techniques, but just to summarize, the tone significantly changes and actually plays quite a big role in the poem. It's one of the key authorial methods used to allow the reader to witness the power of nature in real time. It works well because it means we can change our mind along the way with the narrator, and by the end of the poem, we too can conclude that the power of nature is in fact stronger than humanity. The narrator starts off with a very strong, united, and confident tone, but of course, this gradually becomes weaker and more vulnerable, really highlighting to the reader the naivety in human strength and logic. Essentially, this poem is telling us that humans may be strong, but the power of nature is even stronger. Another example of this, of course, is, like we've said, the transformative use of the collective pronoun we in the beginning versus the end. The tone is also manipulated through lines like, "You can listen to the thing you fear, forgetting that it pummels your house too," to really create tension and later create a dark and unsettling tone towards the end of the poem. It's also exemplified in the line, "Strange, it is a huge nothing that we fear." This being at the end leaves the lasting impression on the reader's mind about the power of nature. So for those exam questions where they ask you, how does the writer intrigue the reader? These are the techniques you would want to mention. Now to quickly look at some anthology poems which we can compare to Storm on the Island. So of course the first one is Ozymandias. Both Heaney and Shelley make use of the one stanza style to portray this battle between power of nature and power of mankind. Both poems emphasize that the power of nature is much more impactful. They both also portray an authoritative figure, with Ozymandias of course being Ozymandias, and mankind for the storm of the island. As we know, both are essentially overpowered by the power of nature. Although both poems are set about powers in different times, it's interesting that mankind continues this naive approach that we are more powerful or have some control about nature. Make sure to check out my video on Ozymandias too, where we analyse and look at even more links. The second poem you could compare Storm on the Island to is Exposure by Wilfred Owen. This would be a good comparison because both poems show the main subject, whether that's the island people or the soldiers on the battlefield, to have to face the fear of the power of nature. Both poems also explore themes of isolation and the psychological conflict through similar structural techniques and imagery. Of course, there are also other examples which we could compare Storm on the Island to, for example the Prelude, which also delves into this idea of the overwhelming power of nature. So that concludes our analysis of Storm on the Island by Seamus Heaney. Let me know of any techniques you spotted that we didn't mention, and also let me know what poems you might choose to compare this to. As always, thanks so much for watching. I really hope it was helpful. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video.